Another way you might put it is if we set your business up the right way, you can spend a lot less time stressing, more time actually building your business. One of my main goals as an entrepreneur, as a lawyer, is to not get divorced. I want to be an entrepreneur because I have 5 kids who deserve to see someone they love and look up to succeed in this world.
Hello and welcome to the Superhuman Entrepreneur Podcast. My name is Dr. Jeremy Ipson, and the episode today is so important. It is vital for entrepreneurs to learn what we're going to talk about today because it's everyone's, everyone's least favorite topic, the lawyer side of things. So I had to bring in one of my friends, and he just happens to be a really good lawyer and has helped me with some things because we want to protect you and keep you safe as an entrepreneur. So Brent, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You want to do a quick interview and let people know about you, about your law firm?
Absolutely. My name is Brian Hiatt. I am the founder of Hiatt Law. We help entrepreneurs set up your business with a solid foundation. Basically, we help you legally protect what you're working hard to build. Another way you might put it is if we set your business up the right way, you can spend a lot less time stressing, more time actually building your business. And that could be making sure you have a solid foundation with partners, contracts, intellectual property, your secret sauce, just anything that you're doing business with, there's going to be a legal component. So let's make sure you're protected, right?
For sure. So we're definitely going to dive into all that because that's important why you're here. But being on the Superhuman Entrepreneur Show, it's not just about being the business side of things. It's about the marriage and the kids and all that side of things. So I know you're a family man. I run into a lot of family events. Our kids are in the same choir. So I know whenever there's a choir concert, I'm going to see Brent and we're going to catch up. But yeah, so tell me, how do you, as a busy lawyer, because I probably guess you're probably busier than me as a busy doctor, how do you balance, marriage, kids, business, all that?
Balance is an interesting term. I'm fond of thinking about balance the way that I think it's in that book, The One Thing. I don't know if you're Gary Keller. He talks about how there's really no such thing as balance. It's more about wherever you are, be there. Like the analogy he gives, if you watch like ballerinas floating across the stage, if you look closely at their toes, like they're actually tilting back and forth. They're not actually truly balanced. And so it's more about just being very hyper-focused on where you're going to be. And so I like to say that one of my main goals as an entrepreneur, as a lawyer, is to not get divorced. And this is not to tick off anybody who did, or obviously that is a situation that happens and sometimes it's necessary. But I love my family very much. That is just one of those things. I commit to myself and to my family that I'm going to do the things necessary to be a good husband, be a good father, all while making sure that the business keeps going, keeps growing, and there's definitely some trade-offs. But in fact, after we're done with this, I'm going to be going to minor league baseball practice. So I'm coaching a couple of my kids in Little League Baseball here this season. So I'm excited about that. So
that's awesome. One of the themes that I get from entrepreneurs as I'm interviewing them is about the freedom that comes. So you two have the freedom to go, coach your kids basketball or I'm going to my daughter's basketball game after this. So, but then you have to, of course, make up for other times. Right. And so one last question on that. So how does your marriage and your kids, how do they inspire you to be a better businessman?
I want to be an entrepreneur because I have 5 kids who deserve to see someone they love and look up to succeed in this world. That is the main reason why I started my own firm, why I started my own business, why I've been in entrepreneurship for the last 20 years, is because I want to be able to do something and be able to show my family, have an example for them to look up to. I could not do it at all without my family. My wife is incredibly supportive. Absolutely, I'm so grateful for that support system that I have with her, but they are actually the motivation for why I do what I do.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think that's why we resonate with each other and want to check in. So that's definitely the key. And last thing, let's just talk about some marriage stuff because that's something that definitely people run into, because I definitely love that goal that you have to not get divorced. Doctors do have very bad statistics of ending up with divorce, so I also have the same goal of not getting divorced. So what do you do for your marriage? What's kind of your secret sauce, like you talked about earlier? How do you build that good, healthy healthy marriage?
So obviously this is going to be different for everybody, but the communication is key. I have been open to a lot of the things that my wife has talked about. I think self-awareness is a big one, and everyone has blind spots in their personality, what they think that they're doing, what they're not doing. And, it has taken some hard conversations sometimes for me to recognize where I'm actually deficient, where I'm not, where I am falling short. And quite a bit of humility, because sometimes I'm just flat wrong, and it definitely is important for me to be able to recognize that. Sometimes
do we need this recording for your wife to
I know,
come back
right?
to
Sometimes I think that I'm right, and it's taken somebody else. I seek counsel. I have a coach. I have business mentors and advisors, and I know that they didn't sign up to be my marriage counselor, but sometimes I get some great advice from those people, and where they're able to look, from outside of myself and actually see where I'm really being not self-aware at all. I mean, I can give you other answers, like we court, we try to go on dates, and we do things that, are really building our relationships with our family. I've taken off a lot of time this last year. Building a business has been great for me because I've been able to do that. And so spending a lot of time, touring national parks, going on vacations with my family, making memories. And so all of that stuff has been possible because of these communication, the communication improvements that we've been able to make. And my wife is just as committed to personal development and growth, and she pushes me every day to be better. Sometimes I don't like it, but it is something that we're committed to doing.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. One of my philosophies on marriage is a good marriage does exactly what you just talked about, that you and your spouse are going to be the ones that push each other more than others. You know each other's
absolutely
know each other more than others, and you know what keeps that person up at night, literally because they're next to you in bed up at night.
Oh, yeah.
And so, but a marriage that does that the couple works together, builds together, grows together, and has goals that aligned, nothing can stop that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and last thing before we dive into the legal side of things, I loved how you talked about, because I feel this also identifies with what we want to accomplish here at Superhuman Entrepreneur, is that you want to be an example for your kids.
Yes.
And others too, because it's so rare in this world to find a man that'll do that. There's so many people that don't even know their dad, or their dad's just not part of their life.
Right.
And so that's super amazing that you have that goal. So, okay.
Thank you.
All right. Ready to dive into legal stuff? This is your bread and butter. People they're always worried about asking me medical stuff, but I'm like, no, I'll talk about medical stuff all day.
Right.
All right. So let's say, starting me, this is what happened with me. This idea came, and I was like, potential opportunity. I was like, I need to talk to Brent. So starting, from day one, if you lay out a perfect plan for an entrepreneur on this entrepreneur journey, from the legal side of things, where do they need to start and what they need to do?
Okay. I guess first I should probably just preface anything that I say, you guys need to talk to your own attorney, right? This is all more like educational in nature, not specific legal advice. Your situation may differ. Your results are going to differ. I mean, you guys know that. When you start a business, it's going to have a different road, different journey, different risks that might come along with it. But
I guess I shouldn't be surprised that you're throwing the disclaimer in
you
there.
You have to do it, right? Nobody can rely on what I'm saying as specifically relevant to them. But I think a lot of these things are principles that that everybody can rely on. I like to look at agreements. When we're talking about agreements, there are agreements. Agreements are just like what you might think. There's got to be more than one party involved, whether it's the business and you as the owner of that business, whether it's you and another member, another owner of that business kind of partnering up, whether it is you and an employee, the business, and a customer. It starts with those agreements and understanding what the rules of the relationship are, because that's really what agreements are. They're the rules of the relationship. I mean, we're both married. We've talked about that. We've had that define the relationship concept, right? That conversation that we've had with our spouses. At one point, we were not together. Now we are together. And you need to define that relationship. And just like in anything, when you're doing business, you need to make sure you know what you're getting into. This does not mean you need to know the end from the beginning. Okay, we're not talking about having a detailed, business plan where you have everything. Now, it's a good idea to have a business plan. I'm not saying not to, but if you're starting up with something and you just don't know how it's going to work, you test it first, right? And then you go and you adjust and adapt. But But ideally, if you know what the rules of the relationship are going to be, which is the minimum standard of conduct, right? We're not talking about, because you can always do better. You can always amend. You can always figure that out. And I'm fond of saying this when I meet with clients, is that when we're working with like co-founder groups or partnership groups, is that we're gonna stimulate some conflict here. We're actually gonna try to get some questions asked of each other, so that some of it might make you uncomfortable, and it's going to be super important to know how that makes you feel, so that we can actually get into what that rule of the relationship needs to be. Because the time to stimulate conflict is before the risk is super high, before you're facing down a multi-million-dollar lawsuit or trying to figure out how to divide a $10 million plus pie. You want to know what is going to be the minimum standard of conduct. And so agreements, and again, you can even have agreements with yourself, how you are going to show up in the business. Agreements are very important to me. They're important to any lawyer. And so I would guess, to wrap up that question, you look at the agreements, you make sure you know the ones that you need to have, like what are the agreements for stage 1, for stage 2, and then come back to them. Because another way to look at agreements is that they're a snapshot, just like a family photo. You take a family photo the day that you have your first child or the day you get married, that's going to be an incomplete representation of your life, right? You need to come back to that every so often and update and refine and edit and amend that photo, right? That family photo, because that's essentially what a contract is if you could take a picture of a relationship and put it down on paper, that's kind of what it is. So yeah, I would definitely take a look at what agreements you have and make sure that you understand, what you're in for and what the other side's in for.
Yeah, no, I think that's super wise, and I love that snapshot idea, because you're right, things are going to grow and change, and you're going to do, business sometimes happens really fast. Lots of questions that I have, but let's say they start a business with, say, a friend. They're like, oh yeah, 50-50, let's go. And, they file their business license, and so that's all. So they don't actually have anything written down or structured, organized. That makes sense. What should they do? Because there's lots of people in that situation.
Right. So when you're just getting started, a lot of people might want to just get going. I will say it is important to make sure you have the proper business entity set up, and that's going to be governed by those agreements like we talked about. So if you're doing business, anything where you're going to be attaching, liability, signing a contract with an outside person, or where you're going to be maybe driving a car for work and you might hurt somebody, you want to make sure that the liability is going to be attached to the appropriate business entity, and that's going to be based on the type of liability, the type of tax, liability that you might come across. And by the way, all of this needs to be done probably with multiple advisors. Your legal, insurance, financial, and tax advisor. Like all of those things are extremely important when you're trying to set up a business, because depending on how you want to make money, it might completely change the structure and strategy of your business. If you're going to be, like, for example, if you're trying to do like a Silicon Valley startup where you're essentially going to set up a corporation, buy shares at pennies, and then sell for dollars later on. That's one way. If you're going to be doing like residuals, rental type of income, that's a different kind of structure. But if you're just starting out with your partner and you're just starting out and wanting to get going, and you know all those things, then just making sure you document who's contributing what part of the business is each going to be responsible for? What minimum standards are you going to hold each other to, right? If one of you doesn't show up in the business the way that you're supposed to, what happens then? And you don't have to have all of the answers to every single question, buttoned down right at the very beginning. But I would say it's important to know that it's there. So like I have a tool that I use with a lot of my founder groups where I give them these questions to make sure that they ask themselves. And they don't have to have a perfect response to every answer. And sometimes the answer might be, let's go, and we're going to come back to this in like 6 months and update those agreements, right? We talked about, updating those. Because sometimes that's really what it is. You just want to have that limitation of liability shield, test things out. And then once you know that this is going to be successful, you have your minimum viable product, you have your prototype, and you know that this is going to be a viable, solution in the marketplace. At that point, it's probably time to come up and make sure that you're a little bit more protected. And so having these continual updates is certainly a great idea.
Game plan, go through some different ideas, and I know you've seen experiences on this whole journey from starting up to selling the company and everywhere in between. What do you have any stories or examples?
Sure.
Let's do like in the middle. crisis comes up, good, bad. So because sometimes crisis is a good thing. And so,
Yeah.
Anyway, so any ideas come to mind of stories or examples that someone can learn from?
So just a couple of examples, like not protecting your participation in a business. I have a client, this was before they met me, before I met them, where they did not have agreements properly documented. And so one of the members got a divorce, and somehow in the divorce decree, that member ended up outside of the business and the angry ex ended up inside of the business. All of it could have been avoided with properly documented operating agreement. Had another situation arise where, again, a group of members, one of them died. They were in the middle of an 8-figure business sale. In the middle of that sale, one of the members died, and the widow did not trust the other members that were still living, and that created some pretty big headaches. But it could also be smaller things like that kind of threatened the identity of the business. Just yesterday, I had a client who has been around for a very long time, like half a century, and they just have not protected key things like intellectual property, trademarks, right? Trade names, things like that. And it turns out there's like an upstart out there that has squatted on the name. And so where it could be a very, very simple, very cheap thing to protect your intellectual property, now if they really want to make sure that it's only theirs and it's their exclusive right to use it, it could cost a lot of money to be able to get those people off of it. And so I would say, it's important to know that you can make a decision. The decision should be yours and not a decision that a court's going to make for you. And it's also okay to change your mind. And so that's why it's so important to keep looking at these things. As far as what you asked about, where crisis can really help you make a good decision, sometimes crisis where, for example, like you grow too fast. Growing too fast is a real problem, right? But it forces you to hire. It forces you to find that leverage, and then being able to make sure that you have agreements in place, like to hire employees or contractors or what have you. And then you suddenly find yourself amplified. You find your business amplified, and now you're able to make a lot more money because you've been able to maybe take a decision that you were unwilling to make because you're worried about the risk. So sometimes, crisis can definitely, make you in a good way.
And often, whatever the type of challenges you get, if you get through the challenge correctly, then you should be able to grow from that. Okay, so you brought up the idea of intellectual property, super important. What are some things that sometimes would be that people don't realize would be considered intellectual property, but are, and they should protect?
Absolutely. If you find that you have an advantage in the marketplace, that is probably some form of intellectual property. Even if it's just a script you're using, like maybe a script you're using on the phone or a website copy. If you have a website, you've got intellectual property. You've got copyrighted material. If you have a brand that people are associating with, that is intellectual property. Obviously, the more obvious ones are things like patents. People think about inventions, and patents are super important. And I'm not a patent attorney, but I know a lot about them. A lot of lawyers, we know a lot about them, and they should absolutely be part of your intellectual property portfolio, your intellectual property strategy, if it makes sense to do so. But get out front and run like hell is also a real strategy. So if you have an advantage in the marketplace and you can get out in front of your competitors and then find ways to keep that advantage, that also tends to work. And so you'll protect those things like making sure that your scripts, making sure that your policy systems and procedures are documented, because in order to find that augmentation of yourself and your business, it's important to be able to duplicate your effort, right? And so having those systems in place, having the policies, the scripts in place, all of that is a trade secret. It can be protected in trade secrets. Making sure that you're documenting it with your agreements, having non-disclosure, some confidentiality, non-solicitation, non-circumvention, just as applicable to you in the state that you're in. Maybe even some non-compete, depending on the context and what it is you're doing, and the enforceability of the state that you're in. Those types of provisions should be baked into your employment agreements, your independent contractor agreements, your vendor agreements. A big one that I see a lot of is when you are subcontracting out. Okay, you're contracting out, like say the graphic design of a website or your logo. I do see a lot where entrepreneurs, they fail to put in work for hire clauses. And, under the United States Copyright Act, that can present a problem later on down the line. if you're working with contractors, it needs to be stated that it's a work for hire, that the copyrights and any intellectual property created under this agreement is going to be assigned over to the company. Otherwise, you could just be buying a license to that work, and they continue to own the authorship. They continue to have the copyright to that IP. So there's definitely a lot of nuance to this. It's a pretty broad topic. And we could probably do a whole podcast just on intellectual property. And when we talk about IP, we're talking about like copyrights, we're talking about trade secrets, trademark, and patents. All of these things those are the main keystones of the intellectual property that we're talking about here. And you protect it in different ways, and you can use them in different ways. But they are just tools. They're tools in your toolbox. They're important tools. When you go to sell the business, having a fully registered trademark or a patent or copyright portfolio is going to be really important to an investor, to a buyer. They want to know that you have the rights to use all of the intellectual property that you've created, and that nobody somewhere outside has this right. I remember an episode of Shark Tank. It's one of my favorites where this person was getting a lot of bids for this deal, and it was a patented deal. And then this person let slip that her husband owned half of the copyright, wasn't part of this company, wasn't part of this offer, and all of the sharks were just out, just like that. And while I don't look at Shark Tank as completely realistic, I like this episode because it was funny. It's just because that happens. If you don't have clean chain of title to your IP, it's going to cause problems for you in the future.
Hey, Dr. J here. If you like what you're hearing on this podcast and like the information that we're providing, be sure to subscribe and leave a review and like the podcast, because it helps us to be able to expand our reach to find other entrepreneurs. Your support helps us to reach other entrepreneurs and help us to help them truly unlock their superhuman potential and make the world a better place. I also have mixed feelings about Shark Tank for all the different reasons, probably that
Right.
some of them similar to you. So copyrights, trademarks, so important. What should people be getting copyright and trademark that they don't realize that they need to?
So copyright, it actually attaches to anything that you put into a tangible medium. So if you design something and it's recorded somehow, whether it's this podcast is being recorded, there's a copyright and it's owned by the author, right? So you have copyrighted works. Like I said, you probably have intellectual property and don't even realize it. If you're watching this and you have a business, you put anything out on the internet, you probably have intellectual property. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's protectable though, or it's protected. Copyrights, you do want to register it in order to be able to, go and sue somebody, to file an injunction. You need to have it registered before you're able to do that. And there are definitely advantages to registering it before it gets infringed upon as opposed to after. For trademarks, what's interesting, and I think it's important for people to know that it's not actually created in the same way that like patents and copyrights are. Patents and copyrights are there, like that law is to protect the author, the inventor, right? I made this is mine. I get to say who gets to do this, who gets to reproduce this, who gets to license it or manufacture this thing, right? With trademark, it's actually the opposite direction. You get some protection, but they're really protecting consumers in the market from fear of like buying knockoff products, right? And so if you have something that looks very, very similar to another product in the marketplace, like that could be confusing to consumers, and that's who they're trying to protect. So it's actually enforced in a completely different way. But your logo, your brand, maybe a tagline you might be using, that's potentially protectable under trademark law, and I would definitely look at that. I mean, there's a lot of free search services that you can find to find out if it's already been registered. Like nobody go and use like a big. I mean, nobody's going to try to like register Nike for something else, right? Nike's got everywhere. Like they've got all the registrations. And so doing some research to see what else is out there. Google is your friend. Well, I mean, in this case, Google's your friend.
Right.
I don't know. They may not be your friend in all things, but
like, especially not your doctor friend, but yeah,
Right.
or your lawyer friend
Right.
overall. But either it's ChatGPT or all things.
exactly.
Okay, cool. All right, so then let's move to the end of the business cycle and say you're ready to exit. I was chatting with you about my friend whose friend sold the business and ended up walking away with almost nothing, even though it was a huge deal. So, things to look out for, how to protect yourself, how to make sure that you get the most at that end step for everyone involved.
Absolutely. When you go to sell a business, obviously there's probably going to be a lot of emotion involved. There's an old saying that the two happiest days in in a boat owner's life are the day he buys the boat and sells the boat, right? And I think the same might be true a little bit of an entrepreneur. The day you start, the day you sell the business is probably probably a very emotional day. Maybe not a happy day, but a very emotional day. And so there can be the desire to just kind of do it quick, do it cheap. And I get it. It's not fun to give money to lawyers. I understand. I'm a pretty nice guy, but I'm understanding on that. Like, I don't like to pay lawyers either.
Well, still every time I'm like,
right.
Oh, Brent, what do you do? What have I done?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So some of the ways that you can maybe help mitigate that a little bit is to do more of the homework in advance. So for example, when you're doing deals, when you're looking at deals, I probably would maybe before you get exclusive with one, maybe test the waters with some others to see, if somebody else might have a better offer for you. You can kind of start that, and that's a negotiation tactic where you have like different offers that you can potentially leverage. Usually, you're gonna want to share some information, and so you're gonna want to put each other under a non-disclosure agreement, right? You want to make sure that nobody is allowed to see the secret sauce that you have, and then go out and just duplicate it. There's a lot of apocryphal horror stories of Steve Jobs doing this when he was at Apple and kind of walking in and then walking out with the crown jewels, so to speak, because they learned so much that they were able to duplicate it. So you don't want that to happen to you. You want to make sure that you have adequate non-disclosure kind of protecting in case the deal ever falls apart, because it's possible that you're being acquired by a competitor, right? Like that's a very real possibility, is that the person or company buying you is buying you because they're wanting to buy your customer base because you're doing something better, or they just want your customer base. So once you get them under non-disclosure and you can start to share, you still don't want to share necessarily everything, right? Now, you're going to have to at some point. There's a period in time that you call due diligence. Now, usually it starts after the letter of intent stage, where you're going to have like a memorandum of understanding or a letter of intent. They're non-binding, but you at least have the agreement in principle, to where you have things like what you think the deal economic value is going to be, who's involved, when is the time frame to get this all done, any specific provisions that you need to have. You might have like earnouts, you might have clawbacks, you might have transition because it's important that you come along with the deal for 6 months or 2 years or 5 years or what have you. Or maybe they're actually acquiring you and they want you to actually run as vice president of a new division. Like that needs to be kind of stated in the letter of intent so you have an idea to guide those definitive documents. And then once you have the LOI signed, which again, non-binding except for maybe a few terms like confidentiality, and if you're down for it, no shop, exclusivity clauses to where you're not going to shop this around, or they're not going to shop this around to find a better deal. And then you're negotiating in good faith at that point to come up with the final document. Once the final document is done, again, the economic terms, and the other terms of the deal, it might be a while. You could have like an initial closing because you're getting a down payment and maybe more somewhere down the line. There might be some financing that's happening, and or other type of transition type of agreements that need to happen. So there's not a one size fits all in this type of situation. You're very much going to want to have advisors by your side, at least tax, at least legal, to make sure that you are not stepping in it, so to speak, because there are some tax structures that are going to be much more advantageous to you as the seller or the buyer, depending on who you are in this deal. And we catch a lot of things, like they try to make you liable. One side will try to make the other side liable for anything that might happen during that deal after they take over. And gosh, how crappy would this be if somebody buys your business and then they put in all of these carve-outs and they put in all of these clawbacks, then they run your business into the ground so that you're not eligible for the clawback, for the earnouts, and then they claw back a lot of the economic value. And then you might even breach the agreement or call it done, terminate it, and it might be completely legal and under the contract to do that, but they've given you back a business that is now in tatters compared to where you had it. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong in this agreement. So it's imperative that you have good advice while you're doing this.
For sure. Any warning stories that come to your mind, whether you've been dropped into the middle of a scenario or started from the beginning?
I haven't had a ton of horror stories, luckily, because we've been able to catch most of that kind of stuff when we're involved in the deal. Don't get me wrong; I've heard a lot of horror stories of kind of like your friend, like you're talking about. But we're looking for things like what my client might be required to indemnify for, what they're going to be required to indemnify us for. One deal in particular that I'm thinking about, it actually ended up okay for my client. There was this push for private equity to come in and purchase, medical dental practices recently, and I think the private equity groups, their eyes kind of got a little too big for their stomachs. This was before inflation started hitting, and so they were buying up all these practices, and we negotiated a pretty good deal for our client. They got good money. We could tell they were a motivated buyer, and so we probably got more cash value out of this deal than is typical. And then there was some other earn-out clauses that were there, and I just remember being on my side of the table because we could tell how eager they were to buy, and so we were able to kind of stand firm and get some terms that were better for our client. And then inflation started hitting, and the private equity group's money started drying up, and then they decided to cut my client loose. But it ended up working out okay because we were able to negotiate those points in advance. And so, like I said, they were able to get more cash out of it. They weren't going to have to indemnify or claw any of it back. But I know that there were many others that were not so lucky.
All right. So say someone is, they've gone through the entrepreneur journey. They have a solid business, and they never thought they were going to sell, but they don't have someone to hand it off to, or they're going to end up needing to sell. What should they do if they haven't really prepped to be able to get that scenario?
If they've been doing their business on their own, and so going into this scenario here, this hypothetical, so they have to sell, but they don't know who to. They don't have like family that they want to split to or anything like that.
Yeah. So they're going to need to go look for buyers and different things.
They're going to need to look for buyers. So networking is going to be probably a big deal. There are business brokers that are out there. If anybody needs them, we have a few that we like, and a lot of lawyers have a few that they know and like and trust. And so the nice thing about having like business brokers is like anything else, like they can go and market your business. And so that's certainly an option. Maybe even reaching out specifically to your competitors to see if what you have might be interesting to them. You could find out, because that's a very common acquisition strategy, is just find out find somebody who's doing what you're doing, and then be part of that somehow, sell to or buy up what they're doing, and then you kind of have that natural succession plan. Depending on how motivated they are, I would definitely suggest making some. Start from today. If you're doing business as a solo, hopefully you have a business entity like an LLC, and you're not a true sole proprietor, because the sole proprietor is actually the lack of a business entity. So it means it's a lack of limitation of liability, which is kind of a nightmare if you ever get sued, because it's unlimited liability. They can come after anything they want. But assuming you have that LLC, and you're treating it like a disregarded entity as sole proprietor, you're probably taking expenses that maybe you might wish that you have not been taking, because a buyer is going to look at your tax return. They're going to want to see what the actual profit and loss is, and you might have been putting some stuff on your tax return that really only benefits you. Some travel that's a legitimate business expense, and or maybe cell phone bill, home office, things that really are not relevant to the buyer. So you may want to have a financial advisor come in and take a look at your books to see how you may want to revise that. It happens a lot with entrepreneurs when they go to buy a house, right? If you're going to go and get like a bank loan to like purchase a house, it can be a challenge, because you don't really have that much in credit. Right. Because they're going after your tax returns. They're not. If you have like a W-2 salary, that's great. You just give them your W-2. But if you own the business, it can be really challenging. The credit reporting is way different, and so it would be a good idea to have a financial expert probably look at that to see what might actually be there. Have a business appraiser take a look to see what the valuation might be. You can definitely do some research. Again, Google here might also be your friend, or Bing. I don't know, wherever you go and do your search, and try to find similarly situated businesses and what they've sold for, and who the typical buyers are. The information is out there. And so if you're motivated to sell, you can find ways to find a good buyer. And if you can quantify the value, somebody's going to want it.
So let's shift just a little bit. As entrepreneurs, hopefully one of our main goals is to make money. So, and then passing that on to make sure that our kids and our liabilities protected, all things. So what can entrepreneurs do to protect their finances and their future, and especially if they're trying to pass that on to
Absolutely.
kids?
When we talk about asset protection, just understand that sometimes it can kind of be considered a dirty word. You see a lot of stuff on Instagram, Facebook, whatever, like the reels or TikTok, the reels that are out there. You hear about things like trusts, irrevocable trusts, and these, even using debt. Just be careful, because doing it willy-nilly, like for example in Arizona, there's a Fraudulent Conveyance Act, and so trying to hide assets for creditors can actually be criminal activity. You got to be careful about how you do this. So again, individual results will vary. Talk to your own attorney, all of that stuff. But from a practical side, when you're starting up a business, chances are you're not making that much money, right? So going and having the irrevocable trust set up that's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars to create and administer, the juice just isn't really worth the squeeze. But setting up an LLC, that's easy, right? Setting up a corporation, pretty easy. Making sure your contracts are appropriately allocating risk. And so I like to use the idea of a 3-ring bullseye. You got three circles that protect you from outside liability. The innermost circle is your legal structures. You have your corporations, your LLCs, trusts. Your contracts I look at as legal structures, because that's a structure that you put in place to make sure that the risk is properly apportioned to the right entity, right? Outside of that, the second ring would be insurance. Make sure you're appropriately insured. If you're an online business, you probably need to have some type of cyber liability coverage. If you are a restaurant, you're definitely going to need to have, comprehensive. You're going to need to have slip and fall coverage. And this is where having an insurance advisor is going to be really helpful, because they will be able to walk you through and give you ideas of what the coverage is going to be. Obviously, for medical, for doctors, you need to have malpractice and other types of insurance. Same thing for me as an attorney. Outside of that, the outermost ring, I call the policy systems and procedures. You need to have, and I didn't come up with the PSPs, the policy systems and procedures, but basically it means do it right. If you have the systems in place and the training in place and the employees that you've hired, that they're actually competent to do their jobs, and if the business is not at fault and something happens, if they sue you, you shouldn't have to answer for that. If you do, and it's something that the business does have to answer for, and it gets through that outermost ring, that's what insurance is there for. The insurance is there to indemnify you and keep you safe in that situation. And then if all else fails for this business, you have that limitation of liability protection, that entity around you, wrapped around your business, wrapped around your life, so that only what's inside of that ring is at risk. So if you've got a patent, the patent could be potentially at risk, but not your house. If you pulled out a paycheck and you've never had a lawsuit in 10 years and you've made $1 million during that 10 years and you put it into your IRA or your 401k, or you've bought, several Airbnbs and set up other businesses, those aren't at risk. Those should not be at risk as long as you've properly maintained the entity. And so that seems to be a much more impactful strategy, that 3-ring bullseye for entrepreneurs. And so I like to use that. And really, you need to set up bullseyes everywhere it makes sense to do so, right? If you have a business that's like a medical practice, that's one thing. If you have another business that, if you buy an Airbnb that you're going to rent out to people, that's a completely different risk profile. That should not be in the same, business as your medical practice, right? It just doesn't make sense, because anything in that entity is at risk from the activities of the entity. So keeping that separated and divided from an asset protection standpoint, that's going to be key. If you want to protect your finances, you just make sure you have that going. It's really hard to grant to yourself absolute asset protection. Like a true force shield of energy around everything that you have in your assets. What we do is blocking and tackling. For the most part, you run plays to be able to get the ball down the field, make sure that you can get to where you need to get to. Sometimes you might make a gain of a yard or two. Sometimes you might take a sack. But by and large, as long as you keep running the plays in the playbook, you're going to get all the way there. So
there's just like so much there. I was like, I need a lawyer to help me. Oh, wait, I got one. All right. All right, what have I not asked you about that I should have asked you about?
I don't know, but I'll talk forever. So
All right, and then why did you get into the type of law that you did with entrepreneurs, startups, all that? What attracted you to that?
So I've been involved in technology startups since my early 20s. I just have really enjoyed it. I got started working for a video games company. I was working for the company writing investor pitch decks, writing business plans, working with the marketing team. What I specifically did, I reported to the vice president of strategic partnerships. And so I really enjoyed making deals and connecting people. And so, for example, for the video game company, one of my proudest deals that I was able to work on, it was really fun, was actually with an airsoft rifle company, because we were doing some exhibition at a con somewhere, and we it was a military based theme, and so we had this airsoft rifle company that was able to to give us the airsoft rifle. It was basically the same type of guns that we had in the game, and so it was fun to be able to have them wandering around. But that was such a fun thing for me to be involved in and see how we can make really creative value, because that's what entrepreneurship is. You're learning to create value where people don't always see it. There's not really a true there's true innovation, but there's not like a true invention that hasn't been done before. Every invention that you see that's out there that's revolutionary, almost all of it. I mean, I can't say this with absoluteness, but it's an idea that was applied somewhere, and we apply it now somewhere else. And so that's what the entrepreneur does, is they see that innovation, they see that ability to add value to something that's already out there, and really create something wonderful. That creative destruction, the ship of Theseus type of idea. And that's what entrepreneurs are trying to do, is to move the ship forward. After that experience, I got into law school and started working with venture-backed startups there. Worked for some venture-backed startups for a few years before deciding to finally hang out my shingle. And now our firm, it's still a small firm, but we are growing, and we are loving working with the passionate entrepreneurs that we're working with. It really gives us a ton of energy in what we do, because otherwise we'd be wanting to bang our heads against brick walls. I mean, who wants to stare at a Word document all day, right? But it's so fun to be able to know that we're creating this value for our clients and really help them, because people come in, their business is their baby in a lot of ways, and so we're trying to help nurture, develop, and grow that for them, and we take that charge seriously.
So, no, that's awesome. And I was just thinking back, when I messaged you, I was like, "Hey, Brent, I have this idea, and this opportunity. You need to look at it." And I loved how you got super excited, just like I was super excited about it. Maybe I was probably more excited than you, but it was my baby, almost excited. Yeah. So, perfect world, you'd be able to work with every entrepreneur in the world, right? But how can someone find the right lawyer to be part of their team? Because I know you can't, they can't all just go to your website. And sign up, but.
I mean, I could say, come to my website, hire. But the reality is I can't work with everybody. I would love to, as much as I can. I love to be able to be a resource in the entrepreneurial community. But there are a lot of lawyers out there that want to be, and so I would say probably interview some. Have some conversations. Interview a few lawyers. See who you tend to jive with. I mean. In all reality, this is a personal relationship, and it's a relationship that we hope becomes a trusted advisory relationship for years and years and years. I'm very happy about the fact that most of my clients, I've had for many, many long years now, and which is weird to say because I still consider myself a young man, but I'm maybe not as young as I would like to be. And I've met them in different places. Usually, where I've met them, it's in some type of a shared interest. Like, for example, where we met, right? We met in a place where we were actively seeking personal development and trying to raise our game as husbands and fathers, right? And so you find people that have, shared beliefs, shared missions, and that can be very helpful, because if you know what that person's mission is in life, you can be certain that that's how they're going to help you in your business, right? And help you with doing this life's work. Yeah, specific examples. You can find them everywhere. You can find lawyers everywhere, but that's why you gotta interview. You need to make sure that you're going to get the lawyer that's right for you, and not just somebody that you dial up, or that your maybe your work's employee benefits offers to you. Yeah, those lawyer factories can be interesting. Well,
I feel like that about the doctor factories that are out there.
Yeah. So. That now, like, oh, I already looked it up on ChatGPT, but I mean, we're still fixing a lot of stuff on ChatGPT. We're still figuring a lot of stuff out, and there's a lot out there. We're adopting AI, and we are using AI in our practice. But yeah, if you are using ChatGPT, to do it for you, I've seen the work product that ChatGPT does. I'm not going to say it's bad because that company has a lot of money. They could sue me if I really disparage them. But it's actually a good product. But what it is not is a lawyer. Right. And that's why you need to, again, interview somebody where you can understand what their mission and vision is in life, because then they'll give you real experience to go along with their legal advice. I would definitely recommend finding a lawyer who's willing to actually listen for what you want, the outcome you are hoping for, and is not just going to answer the question. Because if somebody asks a question, like, is this legal? Is this a good document? Can I do this? Usually the answer is yes. Okay, I'm not going to say that in all cases, right? Check with your lawyer. Maybe it's straight up illegal what you asked, but in most cases, like, hey, I downloaded this document from the internet. A friend of mine who does my same type of business gave me this document. Is this a good document? And I say, yeah, but what is it good for? Right? You want to make sure that your lawyer is looking out for what you want it to do, not just what it actually says, right? Because, yeah, it might be legal, it might be binding, but if you don't truly understand all those provisions, the fact that ChatGPT wrote them up does not mean that they were written for your benefit.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that I've loved working with you, and because we have similar backgrounds and core beliefs. And so, like, you bring up things that I don't even know that I need to bring up because we have that shared interest, and and so I think that's really key. And so being able to find someone that you can connect with and you can share your best interests so that they can keep those best interests in mind, I think is so important. So,
Yep.
Right, any last words of advice that you have?
Last words, no, but I will say, I love entrepreneurship so much. When you're doing something like this, you got this idea inside of you that you want to get out there. Whether it's an idea for media or an idea for a business model, it's very important work that we're doing. Understand that this is a work that we do for humanity, but it's also a work that you do for the people that you love. And so for me, I do it because I want my kids to be able to look up and look at their dad and say, that's a real man, that he's leading us, and that's a real example that I can follow. Same thing for my wife. That's very important. I guess the last thing I would just say is, like, seek good advice. You want to make sure that you have somebody around you who can actually tell it to you straight.
That's awesome. Well, Brent, thanks so much.
Thanks
Take this
for having
advice, and this is how you become a superhuman entrepreneur. If you're enjoying the podcast, help us reach more entrepreneurs like you by leaving a review. As a thank you, everyone who leaves a 5-star review will be entered into a drawing for some exciting prizes. We are here to help you more than just listen. Head over to superhumanentrepreneur.com, click on community, and join a powerful network of entrepreneurs that are striving to be their best. Each episode includes action steps, resources, and accountability to help you to implement these ideas and start seeing results.